Tier 10 Arneson v. Gygax. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson famously co-created Dungeons & Dragons, but they also famously feuded over Advanced Dungeons & Dragons royalties to the point that Dave sued Gary. Gary claimed that AD&D was a distinct enough game from OD&D that Dave wasn't owed royalties for it. The lawsuit was messy, and it also made D&D historiography messy, as both parties made many claims about their roles in creating D&D that they likely wouldn't have made if it weren't for the lawsuit. Resultantly, it isn't always clear if one particular author's claim about the origin of a certain element of D&D is coming from a place of truth, or if it came from a desire to win the lawsuit. Armor class came from a naval wargame. One such example of a contested fact is the origin of armor class. I'm not aware if this was a contested point during the lawsuit or not, but I'm sure it affected this matter at least in some way. Dave Arneson claimed to have gotten the concept of armor class from a naval wargame. John Peterson, the most esteemed D&D historian out there, was one of several people who did a great deal of digging, and he never actually found the particular naval wargame that Dave Arneson was alluding to. John has a very informative article on the matter on his blog, Playing at the World, also the name of one of his books. And while his conclusion isn't concretely that Gary Gygax or someone in his orbit invented armor class outright, he does seem to conclude that it probably didn't come from Dave Arneson or any mysterious naval wargame. I don't want to put words in his mouth, though. I encourage you to read the article for yourself. I've put it in the description. While it's obvious to anyone that halflings are just hobbits with the serial numbers filed off, D&D originally had hobbits. That's not surprising, given that the other playable races, humans, dwarves, and elves, also align exactly with the races that make up the Fellowship in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books. The Tolkien estate noticed, and in 1975 they sent TSR a cease and desist letter. Because of that, TSR had to remove specific Tolkien references like hobbits, ents, and balrogs. Gary didn't like Tolkien. Despite drawing so much from Tolkien for D&D, Gary Gygax maintained that he was not that big of a fan of Tolkien. Naturally, this has been a matter of debate for decades between D&D nerds. I'll link an article on the matter in the description. I think the safest thing to say is that Tolkien was one of the many influences Gary drew from to create D&D, and it wasn't necessarily the primary one. Origins of alignment. Alignment is one of the most iconic and pervasive elements of D&D and popular culture, but it actually predates D&D. Its earliest origin is traced to author Poul Anderson and his 1953 novel Three Hearts and Three Lions. I'll read an excerpt from that novel to illustrate how the concept of alignment came from it. Holger got the idea that a perpetual struggle went on between primeval forces of law and chaos. No, not forces exactly. Modes of existence, a terrestrial reflection of the spiritual conflict between heaven and hell. In any case, humans were the chief agents on Earth of law, though most of them were so only unconsciously, and some, witches and warlocks and evildoers, had sold out to chaos. A few non-human beings also stood for law. Arranged against them was almost the whole Middle Earth, which seemed to include realms like fairies, Trollheim, and the giants, an actual creation of chaos. Wars among men, such as the long-drawn struggle between the Saracens and the Holy Empire, aided chaos. Under law, all men would live in peace and order and that liberty which only law could give meaning. But this was so alien to the Middle Worlders that they were forever working to prevent it and to extend their own shadowy dominion. As you can see, it's quite similar to D&D's concept of alignment. The Elric of Melniboné books by Michael Moorcock also heavily featured alignment, and also heavily inspired alignment in D&D. Strategic Review. Strategic Review was a gaming magazine launched in 1975. Initially, its issue covered wargames just as much as D&D, though D&D's popularity soon eclipsed the wargaming community. A great deal of interesting D&D content originated in the Strategic Review magazine, including dungeon generation rules, solo gaming rules, and classes like the Ranger and Bard. Rangers could get 2 unicorns. The aforementioned Strategic Review Ranger debuted in Volume 1, Number 2 of Strategic Review, and was credited to one Joe Fisher. Interesting elements of this class are that it starts with 2 hit dice, It starts getting cleric and magic users spells at level 9. It cannot hire henchmen until level 8, and it has rules for tracking. This ranger can get 2 unicorns by reaching level 9 and rolling absurdly well. They need to first roll 100 on percentile dice, and then get a roll between 41 and 55. If they manage to achieve this incredibly unlikely result, they then get 2 unicorn followers. Technically, if they manage to roll 100 on the second roll after already rolling 100 on the first roll, they have a minute chance of getting the 2 unicorns result twice and thus getting 4 unicorns. 4 unicorns. Can you imagine that? At that point, I think you've just outright won D&D and don't ever need to play again because you'll never top being a ranger with 4 unicorns. Gary loved polearms. A well-known fact about Gary Gygax was that he really loved polearms. Being an avid war gamer and history buff, that's not surprising. This manifested in that same strategic review issue where he introduced 12 new polearms to Chainmail's man-to-man system. 12. Included in this list are Fochards, Partisans, Spetums, and Lucem Hammers. All polearms I have definitely never heard of. Len Patt. An unsung hero in the history of D&D is a man named Len Patt. It turns out that many key elements from the wargame Chainmail and its fantasy supplement, the key elements that ended up in many ways defining D&D for the next 5 decades, actually originated in a set of wargaming rules written by Len Patt. These elements include Ents, heroes, orcs, dragons, and fireball-slinging wizards. There are other strong similarities between Len Patt's wargaming rules and Chainmail's rules. Gary Gygax is, of course, a legend in our hobby, but it's undeniable that he had a habit of borrowing from other people's works without citing them, and this appears to be such an example. I've gotten this information from John Peterson once again, and he actually has an article on his website where he interviewed the enigmatic Len Patt. It turns out that Len had no idea that he had played such a pivotal early role in the creation of D&D. It's a fascinating interview. I've linked it in the description if you're interested. Braunstein. Another game that was critical in the prehistory of D&D is the game Braunstein. Dave Wesley ran this game in the Twin Cities in the 1960s, and Dave Arneson was one of his players. Wesley's game directly inspired Dave Arneson's game Blackmore, and Dave Arneson in turn inspired Gary Gygax, and the two went on to co-create Dungeons & Dragons. The way Braunstein worked is that a large group of players would control a specific person within a scenario, whether that's a military man or a non-military man like a banker, and they all had an objective. The YouTuber Daddy Rolled a 1 has a great video on the subject, and I've linked it in the description for your viewing pleasure. Strategos. Another stepping stone in the prehistory of D&D is the game Strategos, a military war game published in 1880 by Charles A.L. Totten for the U.S. Army. And this war game itself descended from Kriegspiel, a type of war game played by Prussian officers to practice strategy. These two games paved the way for D&D because they featured subjective refereeing in the same way DMs referee today, which is deciding what happens in matters outside of the rules. Dave Wesley actually came up with his Braunstein game through the game Diplomacy, which was itself inspired by Strategos. So there is a loose thread connecting modern Dungeons & Dragons to war games played by Prussian officers. It's a neat thought, to be sure. Dungeon. Dungeon was a board game that was designed by David R. McGarry and appears to have developed alongside OD&D. It was published in 1975, though a prototype of it was ready in 1972. It offers the D&D experience in board game form, featuring classes like heroes, elves, and wizards that go through a dungeon attempting to get treasure. I believe it also came from Dave Arneson's Blackmore campaign, or just that general social circle, and that general zeitgeist. I don't know how much of OD&D came from Dungeon. It appears that Dungeon was instead a board game distillation of the Blackmore campaign, and then Dungeons & Dragons. However, elves being especially good at detecting secret doors may have originated with Dungeon, as it's a primary mechanic of that class that helps them traverse the dungeon better in that game. OD&D elves are also better at detecting secret doors, but in the case of OD&D, it really just seems like a totally random feature. I don't know too well what inspired what in this case, so I won't say conclusively. It's just interesting to know how early there was a board game version of D&D. I'd really like to play it someday. The Lost Dungeon of Tannisborg. An OSR product that generated a solid amount of buzz recently was the product The Lost Dungeon of Tannisborg, which is a recovery and recreation of one of the first dungeons ever made. It was actually created and ran in 1973 using the playtest rules for OD&D. It's a real piece of D&D history, and it was thought lost for a very long time. I've linked an article about it as well as a link to the actual product in the description below. The Gygax Draft. Another excellent find by John Peterson is the Gygax Draft, which is the first draft of OD&D. His blog has some fascinating tidbits from this draft, as well as from some other drafts and writings that were made before OD&D was published and featured an incomplete version of the game. I've linked multiple articles in the description. Do check them out. John Peterson. I've mentioned him multiple times, so I'll just make a proper entry for him. John Peterson is, as far as I'm aware, the most prolific D&D historian there is. His books have gone not just into the history of D&D, but into the prehistory of tabletop gaming in general, which includes some of the examples I provided earlier. His most prominent works are Game Wizards, The Epic Battle for Dungeons & Dragons, which is the legal battle between Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, The Elusive Shift, How Role-Playing Games Forge Their Identity, and the Playing at the World series, which are all about the history of TTRPGs. I haven't actually read any of his books, but I really need to, and I encourage you to do the same. Greyhawk is Chicago. A funny little fact is that Gary Gygax based the geography of the continent his home game was set in on North America, and actually based Greyhawk geographically where Chicago is. I live in Illinois, but I live in the part of Illinois that doesn't like Chicago, so I'm not sure how much of a win that is for me. Origin of the name Dungeons & Dragons. The final interesting fact on this iceberg is the origin of the name Dungeons & Dragons. According to the man himself, Gary Gygax, he brainstormed a list of 2 name titles for the game, and he partly chose Dungeons & Dragons because his youngest daughter Cindy insisted on it, which is a heartwarming story. I think it's pretty safe to say that the alliterative ampersand format came from the Castles and Crusades Society, a wargaming group he co-founded. I don't know for a fact, but I would speculate that the naming scheme came from the swords and sorcery genre of pulp fantasy novels he so enjoyed. Well, this is the end of the iceberg. I've enjoyed making it, though it's definitely been quite a bit of work. Indeed, the document I've been writing the script on actually has 35 pages in it. If you appreciate the work that I've done bringing you this information, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel. It would really mean a great deal. There were many tidbits that didn't make the cut, so I'll probably release another video or 2 to cover them all. But this is the end of my official, original Dungeons & Dragons iceberg. In the course of researching and compiling the notes for this video, I've really gained an appreciation for just how imaginative and uninhibited the early creators of the game were. I think in large part that spirit of boundless creativity and experimentation has left the mainstream D&D hobby, and it's been replaced with balance, compatibility, and permission seeking. That's something I really find exciting about the OSR community, the idea that you can just do something, make a class, make a subsystem, heck, make an entirely new game. I hope that spirit lives on, and I intend to help it live on. Thank you for watching, everybody, and have a good day.